Well, hey, everybody. Pastor Steve here. Thank you for being with me. Today we are in Genesis chapter 30, and I have to say this is an interesting chapter. It really is. Jacob, he has several kids by his wife Leah and wife Rachel, and by each of their maids who are given to him as wives so that those maids could sit on Leah or Rachel's knees when they give birth. And in their culture, that meant the child would belong to their master, i.e. to Leah and Rachel. Laban, Jacob's father-in-law, and Jacob kind of, it's not real vicious yet, but they kind of play games with each other, you might say. They plot against each other over the sheep in this chapter, and so on. And it's just they're not perfect people, are they? And yet, through all of this, God is working. Through all of this, God is blessing, and what He's doing is He is preparing Jacob's descendants to become the nation that God had promised Abraham that would come from his heirs, from his descendants, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. God is laying the foundation here for a future nation. Even if they don't really understand or appreciate all that God is doing or why He's doing it. In verse 17, God gave heed to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a fifth son. Remember, she had 4 sons, and then she became barren after that and gave her maid to Jacob as a wife, and that maid gave him 2 sons, and now Leah is blessed to have more children. Then in verse 22, God remembered Rachel. Remember, she had been barren all this time, and God gave heed to her and opened her womb, and she conceived and bore a son and said, God has taken away my reproach. And she named him Joseph, saying, may the Lord give me another son. And later he would. So here's Rachel now. God blessed her to have children. In verse 27, when Jacob is ready to take his family and move back to the promised land, Laban, the father-in-law, comes to him. And in verse 27, Laban said to him, to Jacob, if now it pleases you, stay with me. Don't leave after these 4 years. Stay here and work for me a little bit longer. Why? Because I have recognized that the Lord has blessed me on your account. He said, you're here and I'm becoming wealthier. God is blessing me because of your presence. And so even Laban recognized that God was doing something, that God was at work in Jacob's life. And then in verse 43, it says that Jacob became exceedingly prosperous and had large flocks and so on. And let me just say, God is not blessing Jacob in these great ways because Jacob was a great godly man of faith. Jacob had started his faith journey, but God is blessing Jacob because of God's plan, not Jacob's worthiness. Hear that again. God is blessing Jacob because of God's plans, not because of Jacob's worthiness. God to Abraham, and then He repeated it to Isaac, and earlier He repeated it to Jacob, that through their descendants, God was going to create a nation that would live in the promised land, and through that nation, through their heirs, through their descendants, God would bless all the other nations of the world. And He did that in establishing the nation of Israel in the promised land, and through the descendants of these patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, God sent the Messiah who blessed all the nations, who makes salvation available to all of us. And what God is doing here is He's making preparation to fulfill His eternal plan. Jacob's having all these children. It is these children who in the future, during a time of famine, will move to Egypt. And remember, Joseph, the one who was just born to Rachel, will be there as the second in command in Egypt to keep them alive during the time of severe famine. They will stay in Egypt and they will multiply their descendants will multiply. and become very populous to the point that the Egyptians eventually make them slaves in Egypt. And then God will raise up Moses, send them down to Egypt, and they will be delivered. They'll make their way to the promised land, and then Joshua will lead them into the promised land. They'll conquer it, and the nation of Israel will be settled in the promised land. And then centuries after that, the Messiah would come, and all of a sudden, the promise God had given Abraham back in Genesis 12 that he had repeated to Isaac and he repeated to Jacob is fulfilled. And what's happening here, God is blessing Jacob with all these children and with all this wealth. It is part of God's plan leading to the eventual establishment of the nation of Israel. He wasn't blessing Jacob because Jacob was necessarily worthy. He was blessing Jacob because Jacob was part of his plan. You see, God blesses us for a lot of reasons. And sometimes he blesses us because of our faithfulness. But sometimes God blesses us and we don't deserve it. We're not worthy of it. But it's because God has something in mind, something that he's doing, and we're part of the plan. We're not worthy, but we're privileged to be part of the plan. And I think we all need to remember that the blessings of God are for us. Jacob benefited from all these blessings. They are for us, but they are never just for us. God blessed Jacob in his life. His life was better because of it, but God was preparing for the future. And I am a believer that when God blesses me today, it is for my sake, but it is also for things beyond me. And when you keep your blessings just to yourself, you diminish what God is really up to. The New Testament teaches that God blesses us with the ability to work and make money so we can provide for our loved ones, but it also teaches very clearly he does that so that we are able to give. That's right. God's blessings are for you, but they are never just for you. Whatever those blessings are, they are also for a purpose that is beyond me or you. And that's a big takeaway for me, a principle for living found in Genesis chapter 30. I hope that helps you in some ways. Be a blessing to others. That's why God blesses you. I'll see you tomorrow as we look at Genesis chapter 31. God bless you, everybody. Have a great day.